Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Building an Agile Workforce in a Post-COVID World. I am super excited to be here today and also to be joined by our CEO, Miles Everson. But before we do that, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping tips. My name is Bryan Peña. I'm the Chief of Market Strategy here at MBO, and I will be your MC today. We love questions, and we certainly hope that you'll take advantage of that. In the Q&A session, go ahead and enter your information there, any questions you have, and we have agreed that we will respond to as many questions as possible in real time. So while we will hopefully have some time for questions at the end, it is our intention to be as responsive as possible to the questions and issues you may have in real time. So please take a moment to do so. If you have any issues with your technology, please just raise your hand or submit a question or comment during the chat, and I will be happy to help take care of that. MBO, our mission here at MBO Partners is to make it easier for enterprises and organizations and top independent professionals to work together. We've been doing this for more than 20 years, and we always like to say that we've been in the gig economy even before it was the gig economy. We are approaching $1 billion in annual volume, and we have over 60 plus large enterprise clients. Our average project size is over $50,000, and over 70% of our talent are very high earners. So we like to think about owning a very particularly rarefied air with the folks that we work with. Speaking of rarefied air, you can learn more about some of the stuff that we're doing to advance thought leadership and promote the cause of independent talent at our upcoming events. You can find more information about our upcoming events, including our monthly direct sourcing hack that I do with Dustin Talley, our resident marketplace expert, at MBOpartners/events. And finally, before we take it out there, I want to make sure we remind everybody of the MBO purpose. Our purpose at MBO is to give people the control to do the work they love the way they want to do it. And we're certainly looking forward to doing that with each of you in the coming COVID recovery. And with that, I am really tickled pink to be able to introduce our main speaker, Miles Everson. Miles has been a CEO here for a little bit over a year, and I can honestly say that I personally have learned a lot from his leadership, and I am really, really excited to be part of his team. So without further ado, Miles, why don't we go ahead and take it away?
Be with you today. We're kind of in a new world now with these post-COVID and COVID. I don't know if it's post yet, right? But there's still a lot of changes that have happened. So, change has been happening around us no matter what. But what we've seen with COVID-19 is it really has caused a level of change that came upon most of us very quickly. Bryan, can you advance the? Yeah, there you go. Thank you. So it's accelerated change in a way that most organizations hadn't really planned for. And, for purposes of our discussion today, it's really changed the way work gets done, i.e. a lot more remote work. And it's starting to change how organizations are actually structured. As I talk to companies about what they're going to do in the return to work or post-COVID, whatever you want to call it, what's really clear is that there's more change to come. So if you think what happened in the late March, April timeframe is it caused us all to initiate a change, kind of not by choice, but by necessity. And the more change that's going to come is that now everyone's planning on the return to work. And so the change is where it ends up could be anybody's guess. And what we do know is that the impediment to any change is the status quo. The good thing for all of us that, are looking at this is that the status quo has been changed for everybody, literally in America. And so the opportunity to then say, how do we want to reset the table is really, it's an opportune time despite, the hardships that have come out of the COVID-19 situation. But I want to point to a recent article by McKinsey that they published, which talked about what happened during the crisis. And, I see it in spades, which is during the crisis, businesses worked extremely fast and frankly better than they ever dreamed possible. And they did this, again, out of this necessity. But I think one of the challenges and opportunities for all of us on the call here is how can you maintain that sense of seeing the possible and ensuring that you have a really sharp edge for your competitive advantage? Because coming on the backside of COVID-19, just like there were going into it, there will be winners and there will be losers depending on who adapts to more modern business models that will be necessity. Now, some of the challenges that we expect to see in recovery specifically have to do with how do you identify opportunities to recover revenue. And every CEO that I visit with that had a drop in revenue, one of the biggest concerns is, one is, how do I make money in the new world? And how am I relevant to customers? And then how do I act with urgency and really embrace, in my company, an attitude of and philosophy about, we really got to be pretty nimble and regain a little bit of what, we think of as a startup mentality. And this is, again, you see is found in the McKinsey findings as well. And so you have to go drive revenue growth, and you need to accelerate digital adoption. When you think about the expectations of customers that they have, I would add to it expectations of employees, frankly, in terms of how they want to work is just so critical. And so, even in our own company, and I know a lot of others, and with all of our talent, is the rate at which you adopt collaboration tools and other digital mechanisms to help you operate is at a much higher rate than it was even a few months ago. And then the third thing is, how do I think about building operations that can scale, but yet are resilient? So it used to be the mindset was you built scalable operations by having, a formidable foundation that tended to be higher fixed cost structures. But what you're seeing now is the ability to scale is, can I scale up and can I scale down with my cost structure, my operational capability at the same rate that the market or external environment is scaling? And this is where we see there's really, for folks on this call and for what MBO does for a living is, what does that future of work look like? And can we not just embrace it, but can we help shape what the future of work will be like? And so, we're obviously committed to that. And then when you start to do that, though, you have to think of that future of work in the context of rethinking organizational business models, because the old business models will not necessarily be the models that get you success in the future. And so those are the challenges that we see people looking at. I think it's helpful, and we're going to put this in the context of some bigger macro events. But, Bryan, I think you posted up a quick little survey, right?
Yeah, I did. I did post a survey. What does your post-COVID extended workforce look like? So far, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll in just a second, but I want to touch upon this notion of accelerating digital adoption. I think this is something that people miss, and it sounds relatively nebulous, but the way that I think it expresses itself that's really much more accessible for a lot of folks is once everybody started working from home and working in this particular manner, phone calls got replaced by video calls. And I think now the expectation is much more transparent. And that's a great example of how technologies like Zoom and Teams are really changing the dynamic of how business gets done. And that shift reflects not just in interactions on the individual level, but also interactions at the corporate level with expectations of transparency and connectedness that in the past, really we couldn't take advantage of. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll right now and give me just a second to share the results. So the question that we posted on the poll, and we love to do polls, what does your post-COVID extended workforce look like? 47, basically 56% of you say that it will grow somewhat or significantly. 13% stay the same, and then 6% smaller. 22% say they're not sure, which I think is entirely a valid response. Any particular thoughts on those findings, Miles?
Yeah, look, I think we're dealing in a time of uncertainty, and certainly folks say that we'll grow somewhat, and it's a very wide variation between companies in terms of what they did with their workforce Some decided to go to furloughs. Some did layoffs. Some said that they were going to keep everyone on and do pay cuts. And that, to me, the biggest wild card in here is probably what is going to happen with demand for the product or service that their company delivers. Because the external demand will ultimately start to influence what the total resourcing of a company needs to look like, and so that including their headcounts.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, good. Why don't we jump in, Bryan, to these four forces that we talk about regularly to lift this discussion to, we started with it saying what happens in post-COVID, and we're going to circle back on that, but there was a number of forces changing the world well before COVID-19 hit, and those are not necessarily going away. They have a high degree of permanency to them, if you will. And so the first one is that the rate of change is accelerating. And that is not a news bulletin to most people. But what is important is that as the rate of change accelerates, it's also that innovations then converge more frequently. So you have more innovations, and the more innovations you have, the more they converge. And so if looking in the rear view windshield, you can see things like, AI was invented in 1959, and it really didn't get legs until there was ability to have bandwidth on communication systems and, frankly, computer databases to hold the data, and then to start to apply logic to it. And when you look in the windshield, what you see is 5G is now starting to get some real traction, and the amount of change that that's going to drive from a pure where work gets done is pretty high, because there's many things now that can be done if the 5G networks are in place that used to have to be local and physical that can be done remotely. And so we're going to see that have a pretty big impact, in my opinion, in terms of how work gets done. And then the second kind of mega trend is, as these innovations converge, what happens is anything that is of societal importance creates progress, downward pressure on pricing. And so when you think of, the genome, it was only in 2000 that it cost $100 million to decode the genome. And today you can decode the genome for $1,000 because it's being done at scale, and it's convergence of technologies that's making this happen. So you couldn't have the supercomputer in our hands that would have cost billions of dollars 30, 40 years ago if it weren't for the internet, it weren't for cloud computing. So it's the convergence of technologies that creates this downward pressure that, so we say progress is deflationary. And then the third thing here is, this has been around for thousands of years, but the rate at which it's occurring is also accelerating, which is the fractionalization of everything. And what we mean by that, years and years ago, the East Dutch India Company was the first company to be a publicly traded entity because they needed it to de-risk the risk of shipping large amounts of goods on a single vessel. So we created stock exchanges. So we fractionalized ownership of companies. In the 80s, we fractionalized home ownership with this thing called mortgage-backed securities. So what I find fascinating is, in the United States, about 20 to 25% of the population will ever see the title or deed to their home, their own home. But if they're invested in a balanced fund, they own a fraction of somebody else's home through their mortgage-backed securities. And then the obvious ones that you see are things like, Airbnb, fractionalized lodging, the rideshare companies have fractionalized ride sharing and automobiles, and it's happening at all levels. And so one of the things that is now possible is that you can fractionalize the human workday, and you can fractionalize the human career for people, and that's happening. And I think most of the folks on this call can see that. And then the fourth thing that is just so critical is the power of knowledge flows. So one that most people can resonate with is, it used to be that you'd get a paper map, and then it got that you could get an electronic map. But then when Waze came out, it would change your direction or instructions on where you should go based on traffic patterns. So it's a knowledge flow, not just a map, which would be what we refer to as a knowledge stock. And so they start trading, if you will, the use of information, knowledge flow freely. And we're seeing this manifest itself in many ways. I mean, one of the most powerful is some of the leading edge, most of the leading edge innovations in technology that are coming out, information technology, are coming through open source technology. So it's getting a lot of people's inputs to help determine what that technology should do. And that's different than a knowledge stock environment. And knowledge stock is kind of the industrial era mentality that says, I'm going to get an asset, I'm going to protect it, and then I'm going to trade it in binary transactions with one counterparty at a time. I'm not just going to open it up and let it slowly free. There we go. And that issue, I mean, there's so many companies today that make money that way, but those are the types of companies that are getting, running into trouble, if you will, with the flexibility and some of the things that are necessary. So, Bryan, let's just take a look at how we think these forces are affecting the way work gets done. So, the first thing that we want to highlight is obviously there's an increasing demand for hot skills. Most companies, even pre-COVID, when unemployment was very low, they still had many skill gaps, and so they couldn't get the hot skills. And then we see with COVID happening a number of displacements of legacy roles inside a company, and really looking for, can we be more agile in the way we do our work and be more flexible? And this isn't just in the way I do technology development programs any longer. It's really applying agile philosophy and mindsets to the way we run the business. And it links to the second box, which is, in most companies, there's been an erosion of employee tenure on the human capital front, higher turnover, and the tenure going down. And increasingly, there's this adoption of sprints to drive change. And it can manifest itself in a number of ways, but most companies today would not say, this is my 5-year strategy. They have much shorter cycle times on their strategy. And so these sprints to drive change allow you to more demonstrably determine if you're getting the outcomes that you desired. And then what goes hand in hand with that is there's clearly a rise in project-based work as opposed to this role-based work. So let's drive projects, get teams together, get things done, and then define another project and do a sprint to get that done. So we're seeing this rise in project-based work just in the way the workforce works.
Yeah.
Right. And then, to do that is you have to be able to address the speed to market urgency that was referred to in the McKinsey article earlier around revenue and frankly, just overall customer experiences. You got to be fast to market, and you got to compress that time in which value is created, which means everybody's looking for a reduction of friction in their business models. So how do you get a frictionless business model is kind of the overarching question. And increasingly, we're seeing the use of networks, whether it's social or collaborative networks, tools, et cetera, for companies and their customers and their employees to communicate better. AI and big data are so important. I've written a number of articles on this. But, when I have AI or machine learning and big data delivered, you can deliver a personal experience without having a person involved. And that's a personalization of experience at scale, which is really what's happening with the rise of platform businesses. Platform businesses allow you to get a personal experience at scale. And so that's really the trend that's happening out there right now.
I have a question, Miles. When we look at this, the agility, the rise in project-based work and frictionless business models, it seems like the time frame for action obviously is compressing, but how do you measure long-term objectives and build a kind of a longer-term strategy when things are changing, and basically by this example being so disrupted so quickly? How do you build a long-term vision?
Yeah, so look, and you see this in a number of companies' statements today, but once you get grounded and anchored on what your purpose is of a company, then all of the other goals are merely measuring how you're doing against your purpose. If the purpose that some company states is just a tagline that they thought they should do to be cute or to go with the crowd, then it doesn't work. You have to be committed to the purpose. And if you're committed to the purpose, all these other, whether it's a financial goal, a non-financial goal, et cetera, are measures on how you're doing against that. And increasingly, you're seeing the most successful companies have their purpose as their North Star, and then they have the other measures as saying, how am I doing against delivering on that purpose?
I see. Okay. We're closing the poll because I definitely want to share the context in this particular poll was really illustrative. If you just give me just 1 second for it to close, and then I'm going to share it. And Miles, I'd love for you to talk about this. So what is your most important objective post-COVID? Reduce cost, increase efficiency, and reduce friction, minimize risk, and increase program adoption and access higher quality talent. Surprisingly, the winner is increase efficiency and reduce friction, followed a not so close second by access higher quality talent, followed by reduce cost, a distant fourth. What do you think about these findings, Miles? Anything that strikes you as particularly interesting?
Well, look, I think I'm going to start with the one that used to get the, being on the leaderboard in this type of a question, which was reduce cost, right? It's much, much lower. And we see that in other surveys too that we found, and increasing the efficiency and reducing friction is really critical. I think it ties directly to what we highlighted here. And what's interesting, folks, about this is we didn't know how you were going to answer the poll.
Seriously.
This SAP survey is very consistent with what everyone on the video today is feeling, which is it's to the point of this webinar, which is how do I increase organizational agility? We framed it as increase efficiency and reduce friction. And, you can see that the SAP and the Oxford Economics here, that nearly 2/3 of the survey respondents are looking to independence to increase their agility. And so, what we see as one of the challenges then for everyone here is, can you increase the efficiency and reduce the friction in accessing and deploying independent talent? And it'll start to shape your entire workforce strategy. And so this is another one from Clearly Rated that came out, I think, Bryan, in the last 2 weeks. Right?
Yeah, just a couple of weeks ago.
Do you want to just speak to this one, if you don't, so it's not just me speaking here?
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. So this survey was done by Clearly Rated in conjunction with Upwork, and it kind of talks about how companies are going to be using more independently and directly sourced talent. As you can see from the survey, 72% of hiring managers are going to be continuing or increasing their usage of independent professionals. 57% of the hiring managers surveys think that they're doing more strategic work and recognize their importance. And then also, finally, more than half of the hiring managers recognize that adopting a really flexible workforce strategy is going to be super, super important towards their long-term objectives. And I really love this survey because it follows in line with our Four Forces narrative around the value of knowledge flows. And I want to take another second just to go back on that particular topic, because it is a critical element of discussion that I personally have found myself sharing a number of times just this week alone. The way that somebody I was talking to who was an innovation expert talked about the movement of hoarding skills to responsibly being able to quickly engage those new skills. And I think leveraging independent talent is a true evolution of the tapping of knowledge flow strategy that Miles talked about earlier.
Yeah, it's a really great point, Bryan. The knowledge flow piece to remind ourselves of the importance of that. So what are these macro trends and concepts? What are they to drive it down a little bit closer to home, so to speak? But remote work is now more the rule than the exception. I do think time will tell the relative extent to which remote work is the rule versus the exception. But I think it's fair to say that it's highly, highly probable that most companies will now embrace a relatively greater share of remote work than they did before March 31st. It's changed. The shock to the status quo has happened. And so what we're going to see, obviously, that some industries are expanding rapidly and thriving. Okay, we've seen a number of companies, one that most people wouldn't put on their radar, but certainly is happening. I was recently talking to somebody that has a boat store in Austin, Texas, where I live, and they told me that May was the best month of boat sales that they've had in the history of the company. So there's some really unique areas that kind of hits you out there. That another one was a cheese company told me that their cheese sales are out the roof because more people are eating from home, and it's not all bad news. There's certain businesses that are doing really well. Obviously, some were hit extremely hard in certain industries. Transportation, hospitality, et cetera, were hit very hard by the COVID-19. But what we know is change will continue to accelerate, and the change that got a shot in the arm, no pun intended, from COVID-19 will continue to accelerate because the macro trends for the last several decades has been an acceleration of change. And what we can see as it relates to the business that we're all in is that it's going to increase the volume of change in the way the workforce is composed and the way that independents get used and are a strategic part of that workforce. And that means that the talent brands need to embrace independence, not just full-time employees. Because from other research that we haven't shared here today, but again, folks have probably seen, increasingly high impact independents are choosing to work independent. It's no longer that they lost their job or can't find it. Are those people out there? Of course they are. But many highly talented Keystone type talent are working as independents, which is, many of those are the people that we engage with on our platform. And so, being able to access, reach, nurture, create a relationship with those talents needs to be frictionless, because the frictionless component is what everyone has come to get used to in their personal lives. You can get, things delivered to your home that you couldn't before. Just the frictionless aspect of doing what you want to do is so much better than what it used to be. So, you compound that with this next point, Bryan, on the, so what's going to happen? And, we certainly see this being the case, which is on the backside, there will be some constraints on hiring. And one could be kind of policy level constraints from a company, but let's assume that the company wants to hire. Normal structures are designed to grow your workforce under normalized turnover. You're not really equipped for a surge in demand. At least many companies aren't. Of course, there's exceptions to that statement, but can your organization support 30-40% headcount growth in short order if they need to? Do you have the capacity to do that? I think is a good question for folks in this work area. And so, what we're encouraging folks to do is you think about leading your company in the way that they become more agile going forward. A big piece of that agility should be tied to your talent strategy, including the mix of what you want from an independent model component of it and what you want from a full-time employee model. So let's just go on to the agile talent and agility, right? So agility is the ability to move quickly and easily. And ability is to think and understand quickly. So, how quick are you to be able to move? And so what we wanted to do is share a few things here about an agile workforce. And so what's important? And so access to a wide array of talent with multiple engagement modes. So we think that this is really important because if you really believe, or your CEO believes, that he or she are recruiting and accessing the best talent, they have to include in that population of talent independent professionals. And it's because people are choosing to be independents.
Yes.
And so it's a really important component of the workforce strategy, and being able to engage them in different ways than what has traditionally been the model for engagement is really critical. And adaptability, which is ability to supplement or replace legacy talent with hot skills. How quick can you pivot to the skills that are needed to help grow and go get that revenue growth, for example, that came through in the McKinsey article. And then cost flexibility, I talked about before, but an agile workforce makes you a lot more flexible on cost. And so you got to be able to, as I say it, move your cost structure and your workforce structure at least as fast as the volatility of your revenue. So if your revenue can surge way up or way down, you have to be prepared to be flexible on the resourcing side of the business as well. Yeah. And then the last one is, with an agile workforce, we could have used a more almost academic term, but the reality is there's all kinds of research that shows that happy people are more willing to change and are more willing to accept that the change is accelerating. So happy people are people that are doing the work they love the way they want. And are you doing that for your workforce? And can you become that client of choice for talent? Not just full-time talent, but be, client of choice for independents as well.
Yeah, I think something. Yeah, I was just going to add that I want to kind of reinforce the point that we hit a couple of slides ago, which is, I challenge everybody on the phone or on the webinar who is managing a workforce program to approach their leadership with that previous supposition of what it's going to take to bring the necessary resources on at scale. I don't think people really can understand, and the article that is referenced there states it really well, about the limitations of organizations to grow rapidly enough with an FTE-only approach. So a lot of those of you who in the previous poll felt that their programs were going to stay flat, the odds are it's probably going to grow. And for those who felt that it was going to grow somewhat, the odds are it's going to grow significantly. And for those of you who felt it's going to grow significantly, it's probably going to grow more than you think, depending only upon the penetration you have within your organization to evangelize the value of an agile workforce. And so that to me is really a sea change article, and I encourage everyone to reference it in the link because it is 100% spot on, referencing why we should be thinking more creatively about how we bring people on board.
Yeah, so what is it? You kind of look at your workforce and you size it up and you say, how do I think about my workforce? And this is a way to think about it. So you have known full-time people. So these are the captive W-2 employees. And the owners or the company's approach to human capital and how they get treated is more of a white glove experience. It's often managed by human resources. And then what we have had for decades now is more a workforce that is more transient, and we refer to this as the unknown workforce. So you post up a requirement and you match it based on skills, but you don't really know the human. And the human doesn't really know your organization. And there's a multi-layer of supply chain managed there. And so because there's a supply chain, frequently procurement functions have been asked to take the lead in that because candidly, there's a lot of moving parts and it can get really complicated and people try to circumvent the system, all the things that you all are familiar with in running a contingent labor program. And then you have this third category, which is independence, but it's a known workforce. So it's people that are referred and vetted human capital, and they're really on demand and access to you. So they not only do you know them, but they know your organization. And you can do direct involvement with them. So look, we realize that the idea of direct sourcing is not new. So let's dig into that, Bryan. So let's just lay it out there. What is direct sourcing?
So I'm going to read this verbatim because I think it's really important and also because I wrote it. Direct sourcing is a term commonly used to refer to a process by which a company leverages its own employment brand and candidate pool to place talent within a company as temporary employees or independent contractors. And that's the extent of it. Direct sourcing has been around for a long time under a lot of different names. We can go back to the early days of the union hall at the dock, where people would be, sitting around waiting for resources. The notion of direct sourcing and talent pools and FMS is decades old. I can remember a company who was at the front end of the freelancer management movement called computerrepair.com, which eventually became OnForce. What's really different now, and we're going to go into this a little bit later, is the fact that these solutions have harmonized in terms of the demand side of most enterprises are kind of increasing their level of participation to match the supply side of available and independent talent. So it's that harmonization and network effect that is screaming why direct sourcing and talent pools are getting such movement. But at the same time, one of the things that we've seen, this is from SIA's most recent buyer survey, you'll see that 67% of the hiring managers surveyed and 84% of the hiring managers surveyed said they're interested in talent pools, and 67% are interested in direct sourcing. What's really, really intriguing about those numbers is they've stayed the same pretty much for a number of years. And that's the key element that I've always talked about when we talk about some of these newer approaches to leveraging the workforce. These things are not new. And if we look at the likely to be explored within 2 years in direct sourcing of contingent work, it's 41%. I would argue that it's been 41% for a while now. A lot of people have been cautiously dipping their toes in, and we could probably spend some time going over what those barriers to adoption may be. But I think now, with the current crisis, we can make a claim that the time is now. The interest has certainly realized that the strategy of talent pools and direct sourcing has proven to be effective in a number of different ways. So the time is now, and that's really the key message we want to put out today. Is that we've all known it, and there's never a better time to do it than when you're in a time of tectonic change. It's time to implement these sorts of things. But the key element that speaks to these things being successful is the migration of the traditional workforce pipeline strategy to more of a network strategy that we see in most platforms. And Miles, why don't you take us through this differentiation for folks?
Yeah, so this is really kind of an overarching point on business models. And again, I'm going to take you back to that McKinsey article that said organizational and business models will need to change. So for decades, maybe even centuries, you could say that what served businesses well is what's known as a pipeline business model. So that what it is it's a step-by-step arrangement for creating and transferring value. So you have a series of things that are serial in nature, and you have a producer at the beginning of it, and everyone adds a little bit in between, and then at the end there's a consumer. It's a linear value chain. And that linear value chain, when you run that model, it's all about cost optimization and cost reduction of the producer. Now, what we've talked about for the last 35 minutes is that it's not just about cost. It's about access. It's about efficiency. It's about reducing friction, okay? The pipeline model relies on hoarding these knowledge stocks we talked about, and it hoards them and it monetizes them in binary one-to-one transactions. That's the old model. The new model of businesses that is creating the disruption is the platform, which this is enabling value-creating interactions between multiple external producers, i.e. a lot of independents, and buyers, i.e. your company. And then it's about providing an open participative infrastructure for these interactions. Even today in many direct sourcing programs, it's very closed and pipeline-ish as opposed to open participative infrastructure for the interactions. The overarching purpose of a platform is to consummate a match between the users, i.e. talent and businesses. And I would argue for most of the people, in this case, it's not just between you and your program, but it's between all the people in your company that rely on your program, getting that match between them and that talent. And that's where the exchange, it's the facilitation of the exchange of value that allows you to move with less friction, allows you to move with more speed, allows you to access the knowledge flows we've talked about. We highlight here that there's this book called The Platform Revolution that I'm sure some people have seen and read, but as you think through this, I would encourage you to take a look at it. I have nothing to do with the Platform Revolution, just in full disclosure, but I think it's a really good handbook as you think about what it takes to be competitive, and not just in the talent area, but for your company to be competitive overall. And so, Bryan, why don't you spend a couple minutes hitting on the how you build pools of people as we talked
absolutely.
about, right?
So one of the benefits of a direct sourcing strategy, obviously, is to simply bypass a lot of the traditional intermediaries and build your own pools of talent. And our notion of the third channel is operating from a level of knownness and sourcing these folks from a number of disparate realms. For those of you who have been working with MBO for some time, this might be a relatively familiar slide to you, but I think it bears repeating. A couple of these elements kind of go through the fact that all of these sources of work, from your current independents, alumni independents, furloughed and laid off workers who have never been more important than now, retired previous candidates or otherwise known as silver medalists, and finally, external talent pools. These are all new sources of talent for a large number of you, and it really relatively clear cut in terms of building a diverse strategy. And sometimes these talent pools are quite significant and immense. I was talking to a company just the other day who says they're building their ATS right now, is bursting at the seams with new talent, and they are chomping at the bit to develop a direct sourcing strategy moving into the future. This third talent is certainly, or third channel of talent is certainly one that's been around, but also it can be supplemented by building external talent pools. And those are also an element of direct sourcing, either through internal recruiting structures or your program office or the like. It's really, really important to recognize that these things are accessible to each and every one of you. You just need to build a strategy to implement it.
That's right. So maybe I'll just give a reminder, Bryan, that we're happy to take any and all questions because we're about 15 minutes away from the top of the hour, and I want to make sure that if there's any questions, people know that you can post them down below in the Q&A.
We do have a question, which is, do you see an uptick in the adoption of building independent alliances and hunting larger game or larger scale projects? If so, where do you think those entry points will be? This is from an independent who's participating on the call and interested about how he may be able to penetrate and compete with greater scale against some of the larger consulting firms.
Yeah, and I don't even know if it's competing against the larger consulting firms in that question, Bryan. Mm-hmm. I think it is, I would describe it this way. You know, earlier we commented that there's increasingly a greater movement to project-based work. And so project-based work oftentimes requires, obviously, a team of people. And so there is a lot of projects that get done in the world of SOWs by small little firms of people, et cetera, that, you know, have high markups in there. And so we are seeing an increase in people teaming together as there's an increase in project-based work. Because, you know, for a lot of the independents, and I think most of the folks on this webinar today are actually, you know, running programs, et cetera, but for a lot of the independents, you know, they're working on something, helping someone, and they see that there's a need that the company has, and when they're on their own, they can see it, they can mention it, but they can't help deliver the resource. So we are starting to see in our, you know, platform anyway, that there's increasing amount of teaming going on where they can say, hey, we know somebody that's really good at a particular skill or capability, so they team together. And we certainly expect that to continue as you see more project-based sprint work in companies.
You know, Miles, I think we should, for the sake of time, let's go down to and spend some time on, you know, what people can be doing right now. And then we have some questions that we can end with. So let's go through this.
Sure. Yeah, look, so, you know, I'm going to kind of make two comments here. One is maybe an appeal to anybody that has the energy to help make a difference for their company and for their employees, which is, people who lead choose to lead. And so I think it's just such an opportune time for people running programs, working in programs, to make that choice. Lead your company into more flexibility, less friction, more efficiency through the use of, an independent talent composition in the workforce. So what do you do? Like, how do you start that? One is obviously to get the macro picture and understanding that we've discussed today, but some more specific things you can do is really, the first thing is just take stock of your available talent channels. And, I would even expand the aperture on that a bit and say, take stock of all available talent channels, not just the ones, when we say your, it sounds like it's you. It's any available channel, and evaluate why you're not using a channel that you're not using today, or how you might use another channel to a greater extent. The second is identify talent demand and supply densities. One thing about reducing friction is you have to have density of talent that correlates to the density of the demand that you have for the types of skills. And when you do that, it's a better experience for both the people in the company that need the talent and for the talent, because there's greater liquidity in that match market. So it's a really important piece of making these things work. And then 3 is work with leadership to identify your strategic priorities and forward-looking CapEx and potential choke points. We say CapEx, I think it's not just what's on the balance sheet, it's the capital budgets that you're deploying in your operating budget. So, there's a great opportunity to create more flexibility while also driving down the cost flexibility, which ultimately results in lower costs. I reassess your organizational processes and policies to look for friction areas. Where is there friction being created, and is that really necessary? Mm-hmm. One of the big things we've seen during COVID is background checks. I'm sure some people's head on the phone are exploding with this comment right now. Background checks have been a nemesis for many companies. But when you dig into it and you say, well, why are we doing the background checks? The depth of the background check, there's lots of questions to ask around that in terms of why you're doing it and how you're doing it. Provisioning, onboarding, and talent engagement, reassess all those policies and friction points to see if you can reduce friction, because some of the friction comes from, policy. In fact, a lot of it does, not just from execution. And then the 5th item is revisit your extended workforce technology stacks, because a lot of the reducing the friction and being more agile is using technology that is more modern technology that allows for an easier and more fluid process of exchanging information and ultimately getting people to do the work you want them to do.
Yeah.
Then 6th, revisit MSA and agreements with providers. There's lots of terms in here that can create friction and slow things down. And, you have Z-score on here, Bryan. One of the things we know is that the biggest challenge for any company from a real durability perspective is what is the liquidity of a company. And so a lot of organizations have been hit hard. So understanding who your suppliers, what their liquidity looks like, what their source of liquidity looks like, what their balance sheet looks like. Things are very different today than they were 6 months ago for a lot of companies. And if you're going to rely on people to be producing for you and delivering, I think this is a really important component as well. And then, lastly, start building a direct sourcing strategy and a business plan, and not just, the strategy is one thing. And then the plan is, well, how am I actually going to operationalize it, and how I'm going to drive change management through the organization to get a much more flexible workforce and access to the talent that's helpful to the company. So,
I'm
these are the
really
things that I think you need to be doing.
Yeah, I'm really interested in number 6, as another reference point. When you're looking at your supplier sufficiency, a lot of people think about, do I have enough suppliers? I think I can't obviously stress enough to know the true fiscal health of your partners, whether it's your staffing partners or your office supply partners, understanding their ability to weather the storm. Where is that liquidity coming from? Not just from organic growth, but also if they have a venture capital backer, what is that venture capital backer's health and their quality? The landscape is littered with companies that have been forced to pay invoices twice because providers have fallen out of favor. We have a couple of questions, Miles, so I'm going to go ahead and right to that one. The first question we have is from a program manager. It is, we have been aware of direct sourcing and been trying to get the attention of senior leadership. Miles, you've been with CEOs and in those rooms where some of the most tectonic decisions have made at the enterprise level. What are some of the ways that you can build a business case that senior leaders will pay attention to? I mean, the most accessible is maybe cost savings, but moving beyond that, how can you get the C-level attention to something like a direct sourcing or a kind of an agile talent strategy?
Yeah, so I mean, I've done that, obviously, as you know, Bryan, both before I came to MBO, running a big business that was full of some really awesome knowledge workers, right?
Yeah.
And then also being at MBO for the last year. So there's a few maybe trigger points. Number one is when you ask a CEO what her or his most important asset is, they will inevitably say their talent.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, okay, really? So let's talk about how you define talent. And most often they'll think about it as their full-time employees. And I understand that. Full-time employees are extremely important. We have plenty of them, and they're important. But you also have to look at the people that can help drive the change in the company, the independents that they've chosen to work in a work style that's different than a full-time employee, but that doesn't mean you should treat them in a way that causes them to go work. They'd rather go work somewhere else. So it's saying take a total talent picture, and how do we become the employer or the buyer of the best talent on the planet? And if you're really being honest with yourself, that CEO is going to say, I do have to have access to independent talent. Because people have chosen to do that. And then the other thing is, we have some quite compelling data points around, I'm going to say correlation, not cause and effect, pretty high correlation between the more relative share of independent workers you have, there's correlation to higher market capitalizations and enterprise value. And it's actually, there's lots of ways to look at it, but the fundamental point is that when investors really value business, it ultimately comes down to cash flow yields and return on discounted cash flows. And when you have a variable model, you can drive up that cash flow, and you can determine when you're going to deploy cash or not against an opportunity. So it's a much longer. I have a much longer answer, but those are some of the key takeaways.
Yeah. So well, a lot of people would think about cost savings and the like. The key notion is at the CEO level, they're thinking about very, very different terms, and sometimes that seem much more expansive than just something like discrete, like cost savings. So the notion of enterprise valuation, I think, is the real important one that the CEOs focus on, which is things that deliver revenue and enterprise valuation improvements, as opposed to something as tactical as discrete cost savings.
Yep.
How do you see the current crisis affecting the consulting and services industry long-term overall? Do you think that it'll be very different in the modes of delivery and engagement moving forward?
Yeah, so I think there will be differences here, Bryan, but the way I see it is it would be remiss if I was to think that the only thing that's going to change that industry is COVID-19. I think it's like many of the other frankly, every other industry, which is it's subjected to those four forces that I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And COVID-19 is accelerating it. But I do see that, the consulting industry, frankly, as companies go to more and more project-based work, companies that are really good at managing and, utilizing those consultants as a strategic asset will be better off. And so I actually think it'll be good for them, not bad. Okay.
Mm.
The other thing that's interesting is, some of the consultancy firms, I would argue, are perhaps at the top of the charts at being good on managing and rewarding and attracting a remote workforce. Right. So one of the challenges that we haven't talked about with remote work that we've seen come up is that there's many people that had to go remote that weren't used to it. And the effects of physical isolation start to have an impact on their well-being.
Yeah.
And so, you have to be, we've done this in our company, as you know, but you have to be very deliberate about making sure you're engaging people as much as possible to minimize and dilute the effects of physical isolation. I'm not a psychologist, okay, but I've talked to enough of them about this issue.
Yeah.
And it's one of the challenges. And all I'm saying is the consulting firms and others have been able to do that successfully well before COVID-19 hit because of the nature of the business they ran.
All right. I think that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you, Miles, and thank you to everyone for attending. If you're interested in getting a copy of this presentation, we will be posting it on our website, I believe, or you can email me at that details below, or reach out to your MBO account contact. Thanks so much, Miles. I think this was a great discussion. As always, I learned a lot, and I certainly hope everyone else on the phone did. And hopefully we'll see you again next week. Or next month, I should say. Stay safe, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.